I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf. I'm the founder and CEO of the Innovative Leadership Institute. We are broadcasting live from West Palm Beach at the International Leadership Association Conference. This year's guests talk about their work as global leaders and practitioners to advance the field of leadership. So as we think about leadership for a better world and the idea of democracy on the run, which we're just starting to talk about here, can you speak a little bit about why we think democracy is on the run and how that connects to leadership for a better world?
I think the first one is about basically numbers. If you look at the Freedom House rankings of countries, then in the late 1990s, when at the end of history it was known back then, there were almost 70% of the world's countries which were categorized as democracies. Now it's slipped back into the high 40s. So that is a reason for that. And of course you can say always, talk about how we define democracy, but that's a starting point. Then the second problem about that is that we tend to talk about leaders and say leaders are good if we actually like what they do. And I think that's I think the fundamental problem about politics is if you underestimate your opponent. My working definition of leadership is that you've got people who have a vision, who can turn the vision into a plan, who can implement that plan, and who can then communicate it. And if you look around at many of the leaders that we see, Erdogan in Turkey, the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Viktor Orban in Hungary, then most of these people have quite a well-defined vision. They've had some setbacks. They've then learned from those setbacks. They've developed quite effective and ruthless plans to get things through. They have implemented policies without worrying about opposition. They go basically bulldoze through. And then subsequently they have communicated that through the media they normally control. So by that definition of leadership, if people who can identify things and implement them and communicate them, then most of these leaders are very good at what they do. So therefore, I think if I could be sort of highbrowed and talk about Machiavelli instead of Metallica, perhaps. Machiavelli, when he wrote The Prince, didn't write it as a handbook to be evil, but just basically saying, this is what we're up against. So if you're a progressive Republican, in those days that meant to be on the left, and in political theory, that's what it means. And if you have those progressive ideas that Machiavelli had, then you need to learn from the people who are probably not quite so palatable. So that's what I do in my interest in what I call the death by 1,000 cuts, where democracies break down, not as a result of a coup, but sort of little by little. The leadership impact of that is that we can actually learn from some of the bad guys. We also, the opposite side, needs to have a vision for the future. We need to be able to turn that into a plan, implement it, and communicate it. We need to learn the trick. It's interesting that Woodrow Wilson, I'm sorry, I'm sounding very much like an academic now, but of course a president of the United States, but also the first professor of political science in this country, wrote a famous paper about bureaucracy, and he said, well, the problem about bureaucracy, it's a lot of people say that's a German idea, that der Kaiser is not very democratic, and he says that's just a bit like you don't hate knives because there are murderers who use knives. You can use a knife for good things. So I think what we can learn from dictators, we can probably learn some of the tricks of the trade. We just have to make sure they're used for good reason.
Are we setting the thesis that democracy is better?
I think democracy is better, and that's where I can come back to the Tina Turner one, simply the best. Because it's interesting if you go back, and this will be the historical element, if you go back to Aristotle, for example, the founder of political science, 400 BC, then he says democracy is based on the idea of the common meal. So if everybody brings little plates of food, then we'll have a much better meal than if only the best chef prepares all of it. And in the Middle Ages, there was a guy called Marsilius of Padua, who said that the ordinary people may not know best, but if the prince decides or the assembly decides, in Italy they had some sort of democracy at the time, then we could put it out to the people afterwards, and they will be sure to find certain faults in that. And the thing about democracy is not only better because people don't get tortured and sent away, it's also because in democracies you tend to have higher levels of inequality. The more democracy you have, the less inequality you have. Also, the more economic growth you have, the less corruption. So empirically speaking, from a utilitarian point of view, democracies are better. But it's also a matter of political philosophy. Of you think that everybody has an equal and everybody should bring to it. It's not that the meal gets better. It's also that it's right that everybody brings to the table because it creates community. Now that's being challenged by the ones who say, well, I know everything well and I'm a very stable genius, as a certain politician recently said. Most of these very stable geniuses, sometimes they may be incredibly intelligent and they have good ideas, but there will always be certain ideas that they forget about. And they always have a sort of a clique and yes men around them. It tends to be men. And then in the long run, these systems don't last. So when Quincy Adams, no, it's John Adams, not the younger version, said all democracies commit suicide. In the end, all dictatorships break down as well. It's just that dictatorship doesn't necessarily lead to the rebirth of democracy. Most dictatorships are replaced by other dictators.
Okay. So then what do we do to improve the success of democracy? If they're on the run and they're the best system, I assume you have a hypothesis about what needs to change.
Well, first of all, what needs to change is the people who are Democrats need to be, stand up and be counted and acknowledge the problem. If you want to be a resilient person and you don't, actually, if I use a different example, most of the people who were in the concentration camps back in the day, I was a very radical example, there were people who say, oh, it's going to be okay, and then, it can't be so bad, and, concentration camp is concentration camp. Those people did not last a month. The ones who survived the concentration camps were the ones who had a clear assessment of this is not very good. And also willing to use all available means to take it in. So I think the French have a word called bricolage, which is for basically sort of a shop that sells everything. And you need to be a bricoleur, you need to be somebody who takes in bits and pieces and is willing to do things. And then democracies need to, communicate. As Democrats, we need, or those people who are Democrats with it.
And when you say Democrat, you don't mean Democrat Republican, you mean people in democracy.
No, I talk about the rest of the world. They may say so, being slightly rude here. So in the rest of the world, you can be a Republican on the left, and in the rest of the world, you can be a Democrat on the right. The Liberal Democrat Party in Japan is not if the Liberal Democrat Party was in America, it would be a far left, but in Japan, that's on the far right. So the world is a difficult place.
I was just asking because we do have listeners around the world to clarify the term.
So basically, if you're a Democrat is somebody who believes that there should be free and competitive election. Everybody should have, as far as possible, an equal say. They shouldn't be as a result of how rich they are. It shouldn't be a result of how much education they have, and there shouldn't be oppression of minorities. If you believe there shouldn't be oppression of minorities and you think everybody should have an equal worth, then you are a Democrat.
Okay.
You can also say if you can get rid of the government without overthrowing it with weapons and so on. So that sort of system, we need to stand up and be counted and say, well, that system has developed much more. We've become much, much richer. For example, Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and from India, said the reason why India is far better than China is that we've never had a famine. We've never had a famine because we've always had a democracy. And you can never in a democracy allow such situation to be so, deteriorate so much that you have a famine, because the opposition party will always be there and say, well, look, this is not right, get a move on. So democracy works, I think, in the American term, when Madison talked about ambition should counteract ambition. And it's sort of the
checks and balances.
But also the sort of robust debate and say, well, you got this really wrong. I can do it better. And it's that sort of the challenge that you can always be thrown out of office. You can always get the rascals out. So democracy is not this sort of cuddly nice thing that we all sit around and agree, because most people won't agree. It's also the agreement to disagree, the intention to have a pizza culture rather than a melting pot where we allow for the different flavors to be there, but accept that there are different flavors on the pizza.
As Mats put it, inherently, this system that we think is better than any other system is inherently unstable in itself. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, and your question is very apposite, Maureen, what can we do about it? The so what factor. This is a conference about leadership. It's a conference about how scholars, practitioners and policymakers can do things to make things different. And if we believe that the Freedom House statistics are showing that democracy is on the wane, it's being challenged, we need to answer the question that you posed. So in the workshop sessions that we're running at the conference, we're looking at some of the interesting experience from Central and Eastern Europe. We've got to learn from the fact that the transitions to democracy there are very recent, and they've shown powerful examples of what can work and what works less well. We need to look at the reality that we like democracy when it generates the decisions we want, but we're pretty naff about it when we don't like the results. And then we start pointing at populist movements, at mob rule and so forth. So as Matt's pointed out, there are some real things that we need to understand about this real system if we want to nurture it and preserve it, without pretending that it's going to be a panacea for all the problems of the world. The statistics that show that we have a more socially just world in democratic systems are pretty problematic statistics. You have to go a long way to find them and unpick them. It's not abundantly clear that's the case. In the most democratic places has some of the most dreadful social injustices, which part of the seeds of the destruction that Matt referred to, Adams's notion of democratic systems becoming too democratic and then actually committing suicide. But partly that, partly the imperfections. But we shouldn't judge the excellence and get rid of the good, I think, and that's the sort of approach we take. So we've looked at some real changes that could be brought about. We're looking in the more extended discussions at the role of education and the way we learn. We're looking at the concept of citizenship and unpacking a bit more what responsibilities might come with a new form of citizenship. And we're looking at trust, because most of the imperfections in relationships between people that can't be systematized and suffer the things that Matt's highlighted, you can cope with if you have high levels of trust. If people have more trust. We have a politician in the UK at the moment that sought not to trust experts anymore. There's an anti-expert move. What's all that about? That reflects, of course, one of the imperfections in the system. So we have people who know what they're doing, who are scholars and objectively driven by evidence and searching evidence. And here's a politician saying, can't trust the experts, who simply wants to challenge rationality and replace it with visceral feelings of what's right and what's wrong.
So as we're talking about democracy on the run, Veronika comes from Eastern Europe. What would be interesting to me is to hear what's happening with new democracies. So as some people are exiting that construct, others are entering. And so what are you observing?
Well, in the laboratory of post-communist state transformation, there were expectations towards a linear democratization. So there was also a lot of wishful thinking at that time and a lot of positive attitude for all the right reasons. And in fact, the import from outside and the implementation from above of democratic institutions, of parliamentarianism, of multi-party politics, produced surprising results for the refashioned communist elites. All of a sudden, they had to adapt to a sort of system that they were not used to. They had to negotiate, they had to build coalitions. They had to be socialized in a different type of value system. And this produced unpredictable results. In the last years, it has become increasingly obvious that factors in post-communist democracy building, emerging from the attitudes of the governing elites, have altered the predictable outcomes of institutions, of formal institutions. So the preferred style of leadership was a constant negotiation with the constraints of the law.
And that was prior, or is that now?
This was the post-communist transition.
Okay.
And this continued, this attitude, this constant negotiation with the law and with the effects of the law continued, and we can see today the outcomes of this potential scenario. So there is a certain type of personalization that emerges from the competition between informal norms and networks of authority and the building of democratic state institutions. So it's a sort of an existence, a parallel existence of the people who build this sort of aristocracy of pull, if we may call it so, who indeed can alter what we were expecting at the beginning of the 1990s. But indeed, the type of populism that we see now on the rise that could suggest that the elites appear to be inclusive, this is only in the rhetoric, because in fact the type of leadership excludes the people that aim to be represented, and this is a vicious circle of disenchantment. And we were discussing about trust, which leads to creates a very fertile ground for one-party domination, who sells the type of illusions that.
Yeah. And we're seeing some of that in the U.S., I think, and other countries, promising that we're going to improve reality in a way that's not reasonable.
These are troubled times, but when you think about it, it's only been 30 years since these countries have started their experience with democracy. 30 years is a very short time. So there isn't really a reason to dramatize. We need to have our concerns based in reality. The institutions are there and they have had an effect, and that is not something that we can challenge. They have had an effect, but there is still a weakness inherent in their young age, and this weakness allows for those who are in the know to profit from it, to play with the law and suspend the dominating power of the law. So you can change the electoral process to suit your goals. There's this the possibility to change the constitution to better integrate the interest of the privileged few, to play with the rule of law if need be. These sort of things come from a need of instant gratification, if I can say so, because elites are vote-oriented, but they're also very much self-oriented.
And I think yes, and I think that's important, because what you need to do is you have to, again, the American thing or the Madisonian thing about making sure that ambition counteracts ambition. You need to channel all that self-interest into institutions that would work like that. But it's not just about that. It's also about what I call the logic of appropriateness. You have to know what seems to be right. So in most countries, when you change the constitution, you need to have a consensus. The reason why you need a 2/3 majority is because you need to make sure that everybody is on board. And in many of the Central and Eastern European countries and countries in Latin America that have gone down the route, if you get in, then you sort of say, well, now it's my turn. I'm going to change the ground rules so I can be in there forever. And I think what we've learned, and there is an element of optimism when people say, oh, it's just going to be like the 1930s and so on. Well, there are differences now between the 1930s. If you look around 1920, there were about 11 new countries that just became democracies. There was Austria, there was Estonia, there was on paper Romania, and then by the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, only Finland and Czechoslovakia were left of the country. So all the other ones just slipped into tyranny in different sorts of ways. Back then, the military were much stronger, and if they didn't get the instant gratification that Veronika was talking about, they would get rid of the governments and there would be some sort of military rule. So I think we've moved on from there. In most of some of the new consolidated democracies, they have learned from that, but they still don't have the sort of the spirit, the logic of appropriateness. And the spirit of forbearance, I would also like to talk about. In a political system, you need to have an understanding of your opponents aren't necessarily evil people. You can, co-sponsor bills. And when you start... well, we had many examples. Yes, and I think you even had these one on opioids recently. So even now, you have that. Back in the day, you had late great McCain, I would say, sponsored a bill to open an embassy in Vietnam with John Kerry.
McCain, John Glenn. There were some that were well known for working holistically.
Yes, and you need to have an element of that, and it's not just about the institutions. And sort of classic of American political thinking was of Tocqueville, who was a Frenchman, who says the difference between America is that they have learned democracy by practicing democracy. And the thing about democracy is you don't necessarily get the instant gratification. You also have to learn. You have to get things wrong. And you need to give people responsibility to make them responsible. And if you take responsibility away from people, they become irresponsible. In California, for example, people have voted for tax cuts. Then they realized the schools were going to, were no good. And then they reversed themselves. So the people that learned from their mistakes. And I think democracy, if given enough time, can learn from its mistakes. The problem is if you've got strong militaries and you've got many of these other things, then you don't get the time to learn from your mistakes. So you need to give it time to grow or flourish.
So what we've learned from different perspectives, from the new transition democracies in Central East Europe, from Matt, from your discussions about Latin America, as well as our continuous reference to the United States in its current form and to Brexit and other things, is that there is an eclectic and diverse source of things happening that we need to understand. But interestingly, they point in a very similar direction. They point to the sort of imperfections that Matt's referred to, the lack of confidence, the lack of trust, the lack of awareness, the lack of a rigorous and open and honest media, all these sorts of things leading to I think this notion that democracy is on the run, so that what happens when democracy leaves the table, usually something worse appears, and it may only be a short term, but it happens nonetheless. So we've gone on to look at, all right, if there's all sorts of different reasons to be concerned, let's explore them. Let's look at the experience in East and Central Europe. Let's look at the military juntas and the Marcoses and the Mussolinis. But let's see what we can do to sponsor leadership which is less likely to allow the worst to happen as a result. These things are going to happen anyway. So I'm into a protective mode rather than a preventive mode. You cannot prevent the inherent instability of democracy. We know it's a good system, but we know it's inherently unstable. So if you can't prevent it from transforming into something, no, you can protect. And how do you protect? You can have people who fundamentally disagree with each other, but can coexist through high levels of trust. Or you can look at responsibilities of citizens to not become the silent majority, but to mobilize and to say enough is enough. And we're seeing more and more of that happening. Only last week, Matt and I were involved in a 700,000 person demonstration in London at this late stage.
About Brexit.
About Brexit. October 2018 we are, and we're facing a departure from the European Union in March. 700,000. I was really disappointed, Gordon, I have to tell you. I think we should have had 2 or 3 million people. And so there are 1 or 2 million people who feel like us, but are still a silent
majority.
A silent minority.
Why is that?
It's because it's citizenship, it's because of education, it's because of this is just too hard.
But it's also because you've got a political elite who's saying that, that's not going to happen, you've already voted and you only get one bite of the cherry. That's not democracy. Democracy, Disraeli, great British Prime Minister, says there's no finality in politics. Politics always goes on. It's not sort of like we draw 2 lines under it and that's the fact. Politics is always a moving thing. Just because you have a vote does not mean the end of it. That's just like for the time being. And we're
for now on. Just like change in leadership.
Along the lines of what we can do, I would like to just throw this in. There are definitely ebbs and flows of democracy, and as I mentioned, the 30 years is definitely not enough. It's not self-sustainable, it's fragile, and there's absolute need for constantly fight for it. This is not new. It's just that in practice, it seems that it's overlooked. It would be very important to bring back not only institutions, but soft power.
And so define soft power, because I'm not sure all of our listeners understand that term.
For example, having a big country, a strategic partner for Romania, like the United States, who was always present to direct different ideas or to influence or to show model examples. This was always important. So this presence of the soft power of the models of the institutional models, of the models of value and so on. This has dwindled in the last years. And this is not good, because you need some sort of models. You need things to look up to. You need your enemies to not be able to say, but look at the US, they're not doing that great either. They're just like us. And I'm quoting the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
So this is a really important point. Joseph Nye defines soft power as the powerfulness from being attractive. So what gives the United States power in Romania, and powerful to have positive influence, is that it's an attractive place. It's a role model. Not that it's a military power or that it's an economic power on which you're dependent or you feel threatened. But it's a place that's quite attractive to point at and say, look, these are good practices. And Veronika's pointing out the tragedy of change here in the United States is that that's diminishing. The ability to point to good role models from the free country, the democratic example.
And using your leverage as well. So it's interesting, if we go back just 30 years, Mexico is now a relatively established democracy. Mexico was effectively a one-party state from the 1920s until the 1990s. Then increasingly Mexican elites would start to go to American universities. They would come back and say they've got democracy, they've got many parties. So people coming from, so for example, there are very few Russians who study in the West now, which is a problem. So if people go to different countries, they would learn those things. But also, when they negotiated the original NAFTA thing, then the Americans say, well, we're happy to deal with you. However, you need to get your house in order. You need to do all these things. Otherwise, we're not going to deal with you. So America and Canada were saying, well, there's a conditionality. If you want to have a NAFTA agreement, you need to have a pluralist system. So they used their leverage in a way that they're using now. And the European Union used it in the same way when countries, and they use it now. If you want to join the EU, you need to sign up to certain things. The problem is that there's some countries that signed up to that, and then they reneged on their promises, and that's the problem we have in the European Union at the moment.
A slight warning, if it's possible to call it a warning, would be that most likely it's going to get worse before it gets better. So in the context of the current democratic institutions that are being challenged in Central and Eastern Europe, it might get worse for a while, because the elites are reacting to the demands for more democracy, for more inclusion in the European Union, for respect of different values than the ones that they would benefit for personally. So they will react, and they will continue to challenge the rule of law and the institutions that are a constraint on their behavior. So it will get a bit worse, but that's why it's extremely important to pay attention to what is happening in the region, and to make sure that we've got to remain aware, and the voting citizens are aware of the major changes that are happening. They do protest, they express their concerns in different ways, but they are also so disenchanted, and that it is definitely the situation in which challenger parties can come to form.
Going back to what you said earlier, Mike, just the awareness that democracies are unstable, and yet in another way it's the instability that allows them to be sustainable.
So their instability make them vital. We shouldn't, I think this is quite an important point. The student revolts in the 60s, which led some commentators to talk about the suicidal nature of democracy being too democratic. When the students were on the street in the 60s, this was a vital part of growing and consolidation of democracy. And as Veronika was saying, we've done this for 300 years, not 30 years. And so these things have to happen. But the risks are very high. And that's why we're interested. You know my passions anyway, Maury, that the International Leadership Association, with whom I'm associated, has a responsibility to take discussions and scholarship around leadership to apply to these sorts of issues. You can't have an elephant in the room. You can't say that's fine, we can talk about leadership. Leadership for what? Is leadership in a world of turbulence, in a world where the systems we know are better systems than others for coexistence, for social participation, are struggling. and are being challenged. They're being challenged by elites who don't get their instant gratification from them. They're being challenged by capitalism that doesn't redistribute towards the very wealthy, by all sorts of things. So the inherent stability, as you rightly say, is part of its vitality, but it also is a risk that we need to monitor and manage. Part of leadership should be to help people keep their awareness sharp, keep their strategies clear. This is worth nurturing and worth keeping and worth preserving, however difficult. Not despair just because a democratic decision brings an abhorrent result. And some do. Some people vote for terrible things to happen, and it's democratic. Don't give up the system because of that. Just work on going back and reforming and reforming views. The decision of the United Kingdom, this is a personal view, of course, to leave the European Union is an absurd decision in a world that's so interdependent and so interconnected.
Right.
It's proved so difficult to do, which is an example. So do we just sit back and say, well, that's a democratic result? No, but we don't at the same time say it's the wrong result, so we have to use democracy to change the result. We don't have to do that either.
Well, and you also don't have to get rid of democracy.
No, precisely.
If there's one thing you need, is not less democracy, but more.
But more.
And as Catherine Taylor Scott, who was honored by the ILA this year, said, we need the dedication to reality is essential to our mental health. And I do believe that the voting people who listen to all these, the selling of illusions that has been going on for the last years, will not be able to do this indefinitely. There will be a backlash.
Yeah.
We are with Mike and Veronika, continuing the conversations about what to do with democracy on the run.
Right. Well, I was going to make this point about the very important resistance to disengagement. You may be disenchanted by the leaders. You have to differentiate, and the people will have to differentiate between the leaders and the institutions that they populate temporarily. So it's not the institutions that disappoint necessarily, although they can be reformed, of course, but it's the people that populate them that can be changed, and they are not going to be there forever. So resistance to disengagement means showing up to vote. Eastern, Central and Eastern European have very low voter turnout.
Really? Okay.
They do. Even though there are young democracies, and there was in the beginning of the 90s, people would turn out to vote. Now the feeling is that it's all the same.
Okay, so if it doesn't matter, why bother?
Why bother? So they're not bothered. We are not bothered anymore. And this, of course, plays very well for those who can continue unchallenged in their way of doing things. So this would definitely be one thing. And then again, getting involved into politics, getting involved into parties, political parties, who have such a bad reputation, but they shouldn't have such a bad reputation because we have not invented anything better than multi-party systems in order to deliver state governance. So getting involved into parties is definitely something that younger people should do more.
And older people.
Yes, I'm thinking about younger people because they are the least engaged.
Okay.
And they are not targeted, if I can say, by the human resources, resource team of parties. It's very difficult to enter a political party. Sure, this can definitely challenge the status quo.
Okay.
So this resistance to disengagement, I think, is a really important area. And there's a couple of things. For leadership generally, why do we think of leaders as being those who are important, who are big, who are visible, who are out in front? This notion is not helpful. Everybody can be a leader here. Lead by example. There's some contemporary, very powerful examples.
Okay.
The Me Too movement.
Yes.
Let me introduce it as a man. The most appalling behavior by men goes on forever, it seems. It's just no accountability, a sense of entitlement to treat women in the way that they do. But what happens is that there is somebody somewhere, however small, however insignificant, however much a victim, that doesn't dwell in their victimhood, but says, enough's enough, I will mobilize, I will speak out. And what happens is an epidemic of confidence, which is my second point. Anyone can be a leader, but can we generate an epidemic of confidence building that says, well, I can do that too. Me too. Now, the Me Too is not just about sexual harassment of women. It can be applied to all sorts of other things. How unfair is it that 1 in 4 children in Britain are born into poverty in 2018? That's wrong. So we need a Me Too movement for that.
Yes.
Because it's not acceptable. And that's what Veronika's talking about in terms of mobilizing and resisting disengagement. And how do we get young people involved in democracy, in the democratic institutions? How do we get them to vote? They have to do it if they feel it makes a difference to them. They're as self-centered as their elders in the Senate, but they have huge stakes, much greater stakes than their elders. The decision on Brexit, for example, will impact upon people who are currently at a decision to leave the European Union. 15 or 16-year-olds didn't even have to vote. And yet it'll be their lives that are affected dramatically.
Significantly, yeah.
Now, 2 years it's taken us to try and leave. They've become 18-year-olds and voting. How can we get a model in which we get these people to participate and keep their high levels of engagement? So the levels of apathy among young people, we could look at separately and study and understand why and change that. But it's a huge problem, I think, and a huge challenge. You know, I think I've spoken before about the research I've done in Mongolia. This is a very different place. It's a long way away. This is a country where there are more horses than people, but a country also with a very healthy liberal democratic model in its post-Soviet years. It has more political parties, it has communities that have engaged. But you know what happens there? Because of a long history of mistrust of politicians, is that when your person that you create and support in a political party becomes a politician, people stop trusting them.
Oh, interesting. So it's the profession of politics that we distrust, even though that guy's my neighbor.
Exactly. Well, he's your selected party. But once you understand the drivers that need to be changed, you can go and do. So you need to invest in programs that remove or reduce this anxiety about politicians. You need to put different systems of accountability, of transparency, of reporting. You need to introduce things like that we take for granted sometimes in parts of the UK. Surgeries, when you hold your member of parliament to account, when he has to come and speak at your level. You don't have to go to some rarefied, elevated level in the parliament. So I think scholars, practitioners, policymakers, those concerned with the quality of leadership can do an awful lot once you analyse the nature of the problem, the nature of the challenge, and focus on the challenge, not on the system. Don't dismantle the system or give up on it. Make it better.
I was going to say make it better. Yeah. That seems like what I'm hearing both of you saying is, well, the system is flawed, or if you define flawed as we get results that we wish we hadn't, then it has shortcomings. But if my spouse had a shortcoming, I wouldn't throw the spouse out. Depends on the shortcoming, maybe. But in some cases,
I throw something at it.
I think things tend to look grim because, of course, we focus on that one flaw instead of seeing the whole qualities of the whole spouse question. And even as commentators, as observers, as policymakers, there is so much positive that we can also focus on and break this bubble of negative talking about the flaws of the democratic system, the flaws of the European Union that have led to Brexit, or that could potentially lead to a more anti-European sentiment even in the new countries. Because all the talk that we hear is about the negative aspects, which makes sense because that's what you want to improve and that's what you want to point at.
At a point in time, in a specific place. But if we look at the arc of history, we are so much better off now than we have been.
Absolutely. And the Romanians and Hungarians and Polish people who live in a pre-accession, pre-EU accession country, the situation is much better. this is uncontestable, on all indicators of economy, of mobility, of education, of literacy, everything is better. But this is not promoted enough. And the EU doesn't promote itself also enough as the peacemaker that it is, as the democracy builder that it is, as the improver of democratic life.
So Veronika just made a very strong point that reminded me about my worry about bubbles. So let me finish on this instance. We're here at the ILA conference. 1,100 people stood and applauded because Veronika and Matt and others, the panel was very well received. But this has a danger of being a bubble. We have a bubble of believers. And the other challenge we have to do is go from places such as these, from people who nod in agreement and understand the issues, and proselytize elsewhere. There's many people who are not here. We're, hugely pleased that we have a large number of delegates here and very engaging they are. But they're only a real splash in a pond. We have to get out and we have to break down the bubble. So this bubble understands it. This bubble understands the issue, the threat to democracy and what we can do. But how often does it bounce into other bubbles and grow and bounce into further, in the same way that soaps do.
Which is why we are very thankful for your invitation.
Well, and I'm very grateful that you made the time to do this. So let's summarize some of the points, because I want to make sure everyone walks away from this with a very clear sense of what you're advocating. And if there is a call to action, what do you want people to do? Because we can talk about it, but there are things to do to address the challenges.
So I think we need to be, if I may start, be realistic about the challenges, that the system has problems, but don't run away from the system. So the Mussolini or the Trump view about draining the swamp is probably the wrong approach. The swamp exists. Let's make it a more palatable swamp. Let's not drain it, because that means you're going to take it away completely. I know that metaphor won't run forever. So the first thing to do is to say that there are imperfections, but don't give up on the system, because let's have confidence that the system is better than anything else we've discovered. So let's look at what makes it sticky, what makes it grumpy, what makes it a system that doesn't deliver to everyone, what makes it that people so easily disengage and don't get involved. Don't give up in politics just because politics has a bad name. That's a very important message.
I think that's critical. Yeah. So stay. Each of us as citizens, stay in the game.
Stay in the game.
And don't throw out the system.
Yeah.
If the system is not perfect, frankly, the fact that half of the population is pleased with the outcome and half is displeased may mean a sign of success, because all the people with the wide variety of humans aren't going to be pleased.
And the second thing for me is time profile. Forget about now. Now is a static moment in time, moment in history. Actually, we've got a passage of time to worry about. So let's encourage people to think in bigger time periods, bigger blocks, whether that's 5 years or 10 years. So it's pretty dire now. That doesn't mean it will always be dire for the next 5 to 10 years. So time periods are also important.
I think that's a great point. We have elected officials in each of our countries, some of whom we are not pleased with, and that we get to vote them out.
I would like to add that it's absolutely necessary to be fact-driven and not emotionally driven in our understanding of the situation. Of course, everything impacts our life, but consequently we should tell ourselves that all this negative discourse that we see, this is not normal. We have to constantly tell ourselves that this is not normal. We are getting accustomed with a type of rhetoric and a type of pointing towards our lives that just does not allow us to see the positive. So, yes, absolutely. I can understand the emotion, but it is incremental to be fact-driven in our understanding of the situation.
I think I want to build on that. Fact-driven, but standing back and looking at the context, we are so much better off. Back to, if I watched the news this morning, you would think that we would not make it till this afternoon. And yet,
breaking news in the world. Yes, we're living with that, and this is not normal.
And it's on my phone. I can't even, when I log on, it's there. I'm sure there's a way to take it off. But that's the world we all inhabit. And the more sensationalist, the more likely it is to pop up on my phone.
So there are some fundamentals, you're right. I absolutely share your view. We are on aggregate, at the macro level, far better off in health terms, in child mortality rates, in poverty rates, globally. But it's not fairly and evenly distributed. And we are more unequal now than we've ever been. And these are sowing the seeds of dissent. You can't expect people to engage if they feel, and if they are, completely left behind by the progress that we're acknowledging. So there are some fundamentals that we have to address.
I agree. And so the unevenness is getting bigger, and the poverty is expanding again.
I often make the point, in 2016, the International Red Cross distributed food parcels in my country, the United Kingdom, not in sub-Saharan Africa or in Ethiopia or in Asia or among the Myanmar Muslims, but in Britain.
That's a statement.
That's something's going wrong with the international. Why would you divert food aid from places that we know are savagely poor and undernourished and divert it to a rich Western country? There's something going on. And these things will come and bite us, and they will be the reason that the democratic systems are challenged. And because people will look at the system and blame the system for that, when there may be other drivers that we need to understand. So as much as we've had a very welcome conversation, we always do with you, Mike, there are many other things. It is highly complex. And that's why it's worth bringing these agendas to conferences such as this, and worth bringing it to your program.
So as we're closing, for our listeners, this is absolutely a call to action. And what I'd like to invite our guests to consider is let's do something quarterly that continues this dialogue, because I think there's a lot more to consider for us and for the body of leaders who tune in and think about these topics and take action themselves and influence the thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that this ripples through.
I think it'd be great. I think this dialogue has to be a continuous one and not, as I said before, just a moment in time when we're together.
Thank you both. And for our listeners, this is absolutely an invitation to step into the conversation.
Have a critical attitude.
And have a critical attitude. Thank you.